Hello, and welcome to Argument Basics. In this short video, we'll take a look at the argument from authority, sometimes known as the argument from expertise. It's an argument, so that means it's got a conclusion, which is what's being argued for, and it has premises, which is the evidence or reasons being offered in support of that conclusion. As you might guess from the name, an argument from authority or expertise is an argument in which you try to prove that a claim is true based on the expertise of the source of that claim. Kind of informally put, the idea is this claim is true because the person or source of the claim is an expert. They know what they're talking about. Now, the strength of this argument, as we'll see, not surprisingly, depends on the qualities of the expert or authority. Now, one important thing about this argument, among many important things, is that even if you have like a good argument from authority, it is still a relatively weak form of argument, because what you're saying is this claim is true, not for a direct reason, direct evidence supporting it, but because someone who has knowledge and skill is claiming that it's true. So a good question would be, why do we use them then if they're weak? Well, a practical reason is that we can't know everything. The idea that, one person can know like even a significant amount of their field is not something that is, realistic today. I mean, way back, in the time of like Aristotle, etc., someone like Aristotle could claim to be an expert on lots of things because our knowledge is limited. Today, our fields are so vast that even if you have, say, like a PhD in philosophy or chemistry, you would know a small fraction of the field. So even if you are yourself an expert in an area, there's going to be a lot you don't know because it's just so much. I mean, take my own field of philosophy. People ask me, "Hey, do you know about Derrida?" And I've heard of him, but I'm not an expert on Derrida because there's thousands of years of philosophy. Even if I read philosophy books every minute, I would not get through them all. So we use arguments from authority when we lack knowledge or expertise in an area, because if I don't have expertise, then I have to turn to people who do have expertise. Otherwise, I'm just, essentially guessing at stuff. Now, even if you are, in your area of expertise, you still may want to use arguments from authority as well, because they can add extra weight to your position, essentially showing the consensus of experts. So in a practical sense, they're used in cases where if you're an expert yourself, you don't know that, or to add weight to it. A common example of this that we use in school quite often is footnotes and endnotes in which we cite a source. We say this is true because this book, this expert says it's true. And we don't realize it, but we've been making these arguments from authority for a long time, essentially saying the claim is true because it comes from this source. Arguments from authority are also often used as part of a larger argument to establish certain claims that are used to argue for later things. For example, if you're arguing about, say, an argument about censoring or limiting video games or any media, books, movies, etc., one thing that people often argue when they're arguing about limiting access to media is the claim in the field of psychology that certain works are harmful to people psychologically, mentally. And so if you're arguing about, say, the ethics of censorship, you might look at an argument from authority to address the question of the psychological question of whether this media is harmful or not. And unless you're an expert in psychology yourself, you'd have to turn to the experts in the field, studies, etc. So what does an argument from authority look like? Well, informally, and again, people, when they make arguments, they rarely do things like premise 1, premise 2, conclusion. They typically just present stuff. They'll say something like, oh, these psychologists claim that video games are harmful, so clearly they are. And that would be a very simple, kind of bad argument from authority. Now, formally speaking, this is what you put in to establish an argument from authority. And you could do it kind of informally as well. So the first thing you need to establish is the credibility, the authority, the expertise of your person, your source, wherever it's coming from. And this requires identifying the source ideally and establishing their credentials. Now, in this case, the authority is not in the sense of like a political authority. So, for example, a senator or a police officer would have, say, legal or political authority, and that they can, pass laws, and in case of a police officer, enforce the laws. But that's not expertise. So you wouldn't say, aha, the president has political authority, therefore he's or she is an expert. That's not the kind of authority we're talking about. So first is establishing authority. Second, the easy part is establishing the claim. Typically they'll just say or write something. Then you conclude, because the person says this and they're an expert, their claim is true. So how do you judge an argument from authority? As you might imagine, this is, because of the current and recent political climate, super problematic and challenging. But here are some neutral standards. So the first thing you'd ask if you're building or assessing an argument from authority is this: does the person have sufficient expertise in the subject? That's to say, are they actually an expert with knowledge and skills relevant to their claim? Now, this could include what we normally consider like professional credentials. Is the person, say, a medical doctor talking about medicine? Is the person like a PhD in philosophy talking about philosophy? Is the person a, properly, credentialed plumber, talking about plumbing, or properly credentialed electrician who knows electrical work, talking about it? Now, of course, it can also include like non-credentialed things. People can be experts in fields and not have, say, like a certificate or a PhD. And then the question there is, well, how would you tell when someone has the skill and the knowledge? And this can be challenging, because people can have credentials and lack expertise, and people can lack credentials and have expertise. And there are, of course, people who kind of oddly think that people who have expertise, therefore they're, wrong. So the first thing to establish is sufficient expertise. And this can become, especially these days, quite controversial. The second thing is, when people often talk about like staying in one's lane, it's that the claim has got to be made in the person's area of expertise, because even if a person is an expert in one area, it doesn't automatically confer expertise in other areas. So, for example, if someone, say, a world famous physicist or astrophysicist, and they start talking about artificial intelligence or ethics or philosophy, they obviously have the freedom to speak on subjects, but a PhD in astrophysics is not an expert on, in virtue of their PhD, an expert on ethics or AI. They could be a very smart person, and say smart things, but they wouldn't have expertise in that area. It doesn't mean they're wrong, just means they don't have expertise. As another example, a person could be a well-known and famous actor or sports figure, and they might be able to say, expert things about sports or acting. But if they're weighing in on, say, a political crisis or climate change, unless they also have, and a person can be an expert in multiple areas, unless they also have like appropriate expertise in those areas, their opinion is no more logical weight than anyone else's. So essentially you'd want to ask, okay, this person is, say, an expert or, famous, but are they talking in their area of expertise? If not, it doesn't mean they're wrong. It just means that their expertise doesn't apply there. The third standard is agreement among experts. So kind of a gold standard is, if I myself are not an expert, I don't know how to assess claims in that field. So when it comes to things like chemistry and physics and astrophysics and so forth, I'm not an expert. So how do I decide whether I should accept a claim or not? Well, obviously I can't rely on my own expertise because I haven't got that. So what I would look at is, what do the majority of qualified experts, what do they claim? Now, they could still be wrong. Doesn't guarantee they're right, but from the standpoint of what's probably correct, the consensus among the experts. Now, if there's not a consensus and the experts don't agree, and you're not an expert yourself, you really have no way of picking among them because it's not my field. They all disagreeing. How do I pick? And so, like, such a scenario, the rational thing to do is suspend judgment. Just say, well, they don't know. How am I supposed to know? But if the majority of people agree, if qualified experts agree, then the rational thing to do is accept that. I mean, they could be wrong, but unless you are an expert yourself who have good reasons to reject their claims, they're probably right. To use a controversial example, climate change. People ask me, like, what do you think about climate change? And I say, well, I'm not an expert. I took a, earth science class as an undergrad, did well on it, but I'm not an expert. But the majority of people who are experts say it's real, the scientists. So my standpoint, since I teach, critical thinking, teach this type of argument, is it's probably a real thing because the majority of qualified experts say it is. Could they be wrong? Yes, experts can always be wrong. But in terms of rejecting their claims, you have to be an expert yourself, providing reasonable evidence. Next is the question of bias. Experts are people, they can be biased. They can be, lying, they can be outright, bought, or they might be biased by their own ideology, their own politics, etc. And so you'd want to see if they're biased. So, for example, if someone commenting on climate change is getting paid by, say, an oil company, you'd probably think they're biased. Similarly, if an expert talking about solar power has invested heavily in solar power and is getting paid by, solar power companies, doesn't mean they're wrong, but you, of course, would want to consider the influence there. Now, everyone, of course, has some biases, some prejudices. We're not perfectly objective engines, and the question would be is the bias significant? Even if they are biased, they could still be right. So you'd want to check to see, is the bias enough to influence them, and look at other supports for the claim. Fifth standard is it an area of legitimate expertise? Like, is it a real thing? And there are people, of course, who claim to be experts in various, fields, or often like we're dealing with things like health, etc. And there just is nothing showing that discipline is really a discipline, really, a real thing. And so you'd want to, for example, if someone claimed to be an expert on, magical healing crystals, you'd probably say, well, that's doesn't seem to be like a real thing. So you can't be an expert on something that's not an area one can be an expert in. Now, with all authorities, they have to be properly identified because people often say, they say, experts say, leading doctors say, and unless you know who they are, you have no way to assess their credentials. If someone says, leading experts say blah, 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 well, who are they? How do you tell what their expertise is? So you need a clear source. Now, in everyday conversation, we often talk about they and them and doctors and experts, etc. And so much lower standards, of course, over just chatting. But if you're writing a paper, etc., you'd want, clear identification. Now, one concern here, of course, is that there is the question of, is there, a need for an anonymous source? Because one concern in like journalism is the use of anonymous sources. So on one hand, they're kind of unavoidable because if you're a journalist writing about, politics or crime, etc., you often have to cite people who you have to keep anonymous because they might be hurt, fired, even killed if you say who they are. And so there are legitimate reasons to use anonymous sources. However, if a source is anonymous, you as the reader have no way of telling are they credible or not. So essentially, when you look at an anonymous source, you're doing like a double argument. You're trusting in the credibility of the person referencing the anonymous source, that they have properly assessed the anonymous source as a legitimate authority. So you're accepting the credibility of the author and they're accepting the credibility of the person making the claim. And so anonymous sources are kind of unavoidable, but they are, in that regard, weak, because you have no way of assessing them yourself. Now, again, this doesn't mean you should just ignore anonymous sources and credible, journalism and reports, but you, of course, should be wary of them. So those are the standards to tell if you get a good argument from authority. Is the person an expert? Now, again, today this is heavily debated. One thing that's pretty standard in politics is a tax on expertise, a rejection of claims because they're made by experts. But logically speaking, which makes sense, is if someone knows a subject and has spent, a lot of time learning it, they're more likely to be right than someone who is just looking stuff up on, Google. And of course, even if someone is an expert, they need to be talking in their area of expertise. Even though I have a PhD in philosophy, I have no credibility in like physics and astrophysics and chemistry, etc. Now, people could have multiple fields of expertise. A person could, for example, be an expert in philosophy, but also know things about, have expertise in something like running, or plumbing or something. You could have multiple fields. Now, when it's a field, you'd want to check to see if the claim is supported by the majority of qualified experts. And of course, that can be debated too. If there's no consensus, the rational thing to do is suspend judgment. Because if they don't know, how do you know? You don't always want to check for bias. And of course, people often prefer their authorities biased. That is to say they agree with them, but that's logically a mistake. You'd want to check the area of expertise. Is it actually real? And of course, you'd want the authority to be identified. So that takes us to the end of the argument from authority. And good use of this can be very important in avoiding being, deceived and assessing, sources for proper credibility. So, see you in the future.